Good afternoon, gentle readers. Today is November 28, 2024. From our desk with Ross Finlayson, here's today's Logos 2000, which is about philosophy, logos being the word and the root of logic, expression and all this kind of stuff. And as well, foundations of philosophy, so our technical philosophy and matters of reason, the discourse, the dialectic, the query, the quest for foundations of logic and reason, and mathematics, physics, the natural science, and science then, for probability theory and these usual accounts of of our sensuous and as of the natural, of our scientific. We arrive at what we can know and what is there and what we can act upon. The de re, the de natura, the de res and de ratio, these components of what make for reasoning. So that's pretty ambitious and one hopes thorough, and there's much to be made for a coherent account of what here is as of a deconstructive account from the greatest lessons and teachings we can find over history, or the canon and the dogma and the doctrine and the dogma, to arrive at the least amount, though, that it helps stand up what's arrived at what must be a sum of histories and the sum of potentials, with least action and a least gradient, a minimal tendency and propensity, as it were, of the theory overall. And that is deconstructive in the sense that the accounts are elementary accounts. Our fundamental accounts have what become these independent entities called elements. And so they can put themselves together or see themselves together any which way at all. That's expansion of comprehension. And then that there are particular accounts that when these are made up kind of in the middle of things, that they decompose to further more elementary accounts, the elements and the elements, the primary and the primeval, the primordial, these being reflections on the ways that things come together, these various laws, rules, the regular, the rulal, the modular, for a theory that's true overall, and then it's consistent and complete and constant and concrete, is as to make for that there's consistency and constancy and diversity and variety. That's just kind of the way these things are. So it's then a result of kind of a very structuralist account, meaning is deconstructive the elementary accounts that in any posited or axiomatized or stipulated account, it as well has to be thoroughly deconstructible. And then besides as to its elements, then for any particular domain or for any particular aspect of the heno-theory, that which reflects all the different ways that this one theory has to be each of these different theories, is still one theory, each of these different theories, makes for that a structuralist in this sense that then arrives as back together in all these ways, constantly, consistently, completely, and concretely. So this is a usual account of those kinds of things. Here then is the axiomless natural deduction, the idea derived from something from nothing. Here's one of these books that kind of got started in the philosophical foreground, and it's Robert Nozick's Philosophical Explanations, winner of the Ralph Waldo Emerson of Phi Beta Kappa Award, which is a National Honor Society for college students for academic excellence. And what we have here is he's talking about his theory of an explanations and explanatory factors. And this is to bridge a bit of the gap when this logic is positive. It has only kind of inductive accounts that so follow from axioms, and then however that's arrived at then is just wrapped up and given and saying, and tossed over the fence, as it were, and saying, now receiving this axiom package, then all that can possibly be said about it is what it makes of itself. And so the explanatory factors go to answer kind of like that anything that is has all its question words associated with it with regards to every relation that can possibly be. So in the fuller and wider dialectic, there is that it's not merely the closed and the inductive account, because while that is tractable, it's sensible and tractable and fungible, that there's any other account with regards to whether it's sensible and fungible and tractable to that. So the explanatory factors basically introduces answering all the question words, which are matters of deduction, vis-a-vis making statements and seeing statements so follow, assertions and stipulations as after axioms, that as well all the possible positings of queries or questions make for each of the question words, or interrogatives, as their parts of speech are usually relayed, with regards to what, when, why, wow, what, when, why, wow, what, when, why, how, and where, and these that it's usually kind of as descendant all from why, like why is something so, and vis-a-vis this cause, and then representing various modalities and temporalities with regards to location or time, space and time, these other question words, and then of course with regards to who and whom and whence and these various approaches of the parts of speech, question words and interrogatives that fill in a placeholder for whatever they may so be, and always refer to objects and not in the land of tertium non datur, which is true or false, yes or no questions, questions with answer that's true or false, or statements that arrive at saying that something is so or not so. The wider account is then for these explanatory factors to address and provide for any given particular question so queried relating anything to any other thing, that the explanatory factors arise as to why something is so, and that may be so because, well, it's just part of the mere inductive account, or for whatever other reason, that then whatever offers these explanations is the same thing as offering axioms in a wider theory. So it's kind of an axiomatic account. And then it kind of represents kind of a philosophy of Nozick, and he's describing various reasons that he would reason to think about some things with regards to things like the conjunctive and disjunctive and syllogism, and knowledge and skepticism is the title of a chapter here, with regards to knowledge and uncertainty and expectations and uncertainty, with regards to what's surprising and astonishing vis-a-vis what is entirely improbable or even impossible, with regards to expectations, conditional expectations, and probabilities, as after statistics, and then various laws of numbers that arrive at for probability theory about how it's possible to say some things about random variables and mathematics itself, and as statistics that's purely a mathematical statistics and probability theory, vis-a-vis any attachment to any sort of system of reasoning of expectations and measures of information and knowledge and surprise or astonishment, uncertainty usually. So Nozick's book here, he represents various ideas that go on with regards to matters of language and evidence with regards to causality and correlation. Here, for example, he introduces Lewis Carroll's problem and Achilles and the tortoise. And he says, he asserts that something is causally related and that its cause exists. And then he says that it also must be that he has to establish this stipulation that causality exists, because I imagine there's some other reason why it does not. And so he says this is how the regress stops in what's talking about empirical evidential relations, And I must just so imagine that he mentions the fallacy of material implication to arrive at why he would need this, because otherwise it kind of is a given that causality is causality is causality, and axioms are their own sorts of truths in the models of any theories with regards to the independence of axioms, the non-contradiction of axioms, the consistency of axioms, with regards to the linearity and their circularity. That I would have to read back a ways to find out exactly what sort of meta-theory he was speaking to address with regards to then why that would be an issue. And a lot of it then is also for matters of theories and models and language, that then the models also make their own language, and as for example, matters of inference and answering the question words, answering the questions. Has that there's some matters of language. I was reading a book of Chomsky, who's a grammarian, and most known for various classifications of computational complexity in terms of time and space, in the parsing of grammars of languages, using a mechanistic setting of a particularly contrived inductive state. And so what he introduces Plato versus Plato's argument is that which we know that we can't figure out. And the other side, I was trying to figure out what it was. It wasn't Plato's problem. It was Gödel's problem or something like that, but it wasn't. And then he related that though as whether or not there could be a true amount of things for Plato, and whether or not there could be words enough to attain for it. Is how can we know, given all the data there is, and how can we not know, given that there's no data? So the point here is that it relates to this Comenius language in the words, which is an abstract theory of the heno-theory and all the objects in it, truisms and consistent and complete together, that this Comenius language affects to solve one of these problems. And then this Coleridge language is the idea of the other side, what our metaphor can attain to and what our metaphor achieves, and that there's a strong metonymy that it attains to, and that it is. That in such manners, some of these other ideas of what arrived at conclusions that things were had an end to their ability to carry out into a complete reasoning, like Church-Rosser or Ross Littlewood, or and the Entscheidungsproblem, or branching, Church-Rice. These being considered paradoxes, but they just demonstrate that something ends, as with regards to otherwise in the infinitary reasoning, that there's a model where it does and there's a model where it doesn't. Has that? There is a model where it does, because otherwise some of these issues were built out for plain inductive inference, are just having found out that they don't complete themselves, which would be a riddle in itself, which would be a fallacy in itself. That still there's this wider universe of the entire domain of discourse, that the domain of discourse is everything that's ever said in a universe of objects, that is still full and real and whole again. That it is this sort of dualistic monism that can arrive at being all one thing, and as well its own thing, and then as well each person has their own approach to it, and that then thusly some of these types of theorems, and for example Gödel's incompleteness of the either variety, that it's independent incompleteness or non-contradiction either way, have counterexamples in a wider extraordinary theory. It arrives at an extraordinary theory for all these logical paradoxes that are otherwise built in an ordinary theory, which is not really a true thing necessarily about infinity. So that the how one might say ubiquitous ordinals make for an infinity that is universal, that these domains of discourse do not include the domains of discourse. They do not include the universe itself. The theories with universes have these things to acknowledge, that they exist. And it goes without saying that from Nozick, for the fundamental question of metaphysics, that they arrive from what is above is as what is below, this way, to then make it so that then otherwise these notions can help affect to relate that, well, motion occurs from point A to point B, and it's an infinitary process, and there's already inductive account that it never does. Yet it does. Is that to be a paradox? No, there are no paradoxes in this logical technical setting. There may be considered that there is one at all that we can never know, and that there is, the miraculous of it at all, super scientific, super sensual, and supernatural, this omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, that's part of the silver thread and the Shastra and this kind of stuff. Yet at the same time, it's absent reasoning to say that there isn't another better theory that is not absent reasoning about all the things. Here are all the objects of the logical discourse, all the objects of the mathematical discourse, most commonly known as geometry and numbers. To arrive at then, at least this is more fulfilling in a sense to a nihilism of an existentialism bereft of these sorts of reasonings, since there's a certain particular association that can never be sensed by the physical senses. It as well is ignorant of the mental senses that anything could arrive at this. Any mental process could arrive at the same sort of theory as dual monism and axiomless natural deduction, then to arrive at things like axiomless geometry, so that foundations can be profound and it's not invented, because then all these theories that the theories are in eventually have a place to live, and not just merely a place to end, unfulfilled. So that's something that takes some saying, yet as well then can arrive at the thing. So I'd like to reread a bit from, I seem to recall it's about page 128, some of the considerations, why is there something rather than nothing. So that's the name of this chapter. It seems that a law cannot have a separate ontological status, for then it would not reach out to events by itself. Yet if a law simply states a pattern showing in events, it is merely descriptive. But the law has no bit of ontological status of its own, and how can it not if it goes beyond actual events to subjunctive facts? Then how can laws be used to explain? So this is, for geometry's sake, it's the ruleo, and the ruleo again. There's three inductive rules, each which attains to the other ones, and neither which can complete themselves on their own sake. And then it takes this deductive account to arrive at that there's dispersion and there's regularity in that, and then there's increment and there's regularity in that. Here, for example, as we have deconstructive accounts of the laws of arithmetic as separating addition on one side and after increment, and division on the other side, and making what's called long subtraction, instead of just having increment and then multiplication, and then after that inverses, to making it so that these two things superimpose and come together and be a thing, instead of being reiterated and reified and coming around as a combined operation, that it makes for thusly this deconstructive account that when there are these multiple rulealities involved, these multiple regularities, making for modularity for the numbers in geometry, the whole numbers in geometry, as has been discussed here, that we can start with the real numbers and wholes and all the real numbers among them, and result integers, those that have the integral of themselves, that they're integral, the integers, the wholes, the counting numbers, the whole numbers, vis-a-vis the real numbers, that either way they build themselves this way. So when that's to make an geometrization of things, for an arithmetization of things, of an algebrization of things, to then relate a model theory of facts according to otherwise words in a natural language and then a symbolic language, these explanatory factors, that it arrives that whatever can be made as of a continuum of these things reflects the same thing. So that goes to help establish answering these questions that Nozick raises in the affirmative, in the sense that otherwise he's having to accommodate that it was a given that none of these things could ever be so. And in that way, it's a strength because there's no ontological commitment to them. But the idea is that there's not really anything more than a zero ontological commitment to something that's already true for itself, the laws of numbers. The laws of arithmetic, trichotomy and inequality and the existence of the operators and their unique products, and that they're closed, meaning that it's always contained in the same structure, have a way to look at them as being deconstructed, and thusly it's an entirely different elementary account that arrives at the same elementary account. So that's just a way to show that when there's a theory, it can be handled all the way on its own terms in the least kind of axioms, as after a reverse mathematics in a sense, that it as well arises from all these other things. And so there's different ways to address these same questions that Nozick raises, simply equipping the theory underneath with a foundation already, and then that this mathematical Platonism helps make this stronger logicist positivism or logical positivism that otherwise is given out to reason as like, and now given finally the package of facts and axioms and stipulations, what deduction and induction can arrive at each. So this axiomless natural deduction, that there's theory at all. So when asked what theory we're in, it's like, it's in theory. That then this axiomless geometry is as well so present. And then it makes for all sorts usual models where, according to continuity and the consequences of continuity, complete there can be. So back at the beginning of this, 128. Here on page 163, Nozick relates. Similarly, the mystic who experiences himself as the infinite perfect underlay of everything, neither existing nor non-existing, whether in the experience that Atman equal Brahman or in the experience of being the void, has to explain why he did not always realize this, his own true nature. The forest and the trees. Since he didn't experience himself becoming ignorant, his explanation of his recent ignorance is always only a hypothesis. So mystics present different theories here as well. Well, here that's just given as that does not have very much technical attachment. It's technical detachment and disassociation of the regular sort, instead of a conscious deconstructive account to arrive at structuralism on its own terms, universals, vis-a-vis. Here there's also, with regards to these kinds of touchstones of matters of relation and reevaluation of thought, like the Atman and Brahman, that those are seen as exercises in geometric perspective and projection for themselves, as with regards to an abstract observer and this kind of thing. So at the same time, mysticism is simply part of abstract theory, which may be absurd, as discussed, that absurd means two things. And one of it is like trying to make forms, the zerds, out of something, out of like the absurd, out of the absurd, to make forms of things. Another thing is like beyond that, is like it's the absurd, which means that it is fanciful perhaps, and possibly as after or for matters of inference and reason, just not so necessarily due or worthy any kind of ontological commitment as to matters of fact, or relaying in a broader discourse the definitions of words of various sorts. He speaks about meditative procedure. None of the literature I know describes what experience the quieting meditative procedure would produce in the absence of any unusual reality or self. So here it seems he's making for an exercise and a discourse in thinking and this kind of thing. He gets into mentioning empiricist methodology, which is usual practical matters of science, and making do. And also the necessity to not just be able to infer about things and have one's own theory or instinct about things, but also to relay it, that the empiricist is also after inductive courses of events that was reproducible, it returns, and vis-a-vis that it's observable, and not necessarily for the theory so falsifiable, which then makes it a science. This empiricist methodology mentions presumably would have us treat the mystic's experiences as on par with all other experiences. Well, yeah, they're matters of sense and perception, but then as with regards to them being observable is kind of what's let in and let out. Because the mystic experience, one would imagine, could be very subjective and personal, vis-a-vis what it's able to be theoretically as of the entirely, thoroughly interobjective when it's a matter of being in accordance with the universe or these kinds of things. I've been reading Copleston's history of philosophers, and he starts at Descartes, and I got up to, well, he starts long ago, but in the volume that I have, he starts at Descartes, and then talks about Pascal, and then Malebranche, and then a lot about Spinoza, who is considered and discussed here a bit more. And then in Spinoza, I really like because he picks up for Duns Scotus the supernatural and the infinity is in. And then it's kind of given that infinity is in. And then there's a lot that goes on with regards to that. It was said that he was an atheist, but then he always is referring to the deity in these things. And they said it was, they called him atheist because it was deistic, but not as of the image of made in man's image, the deity as in man's image itself, which was given that was the only way it would not be atheistic. The only way, in that sense, to be atheistic would not be that way. So that said, that Spinoza was definitely not atheistic, what you call it today. And as with regards to that, he also said that all these things about universals reasoning are given to that, because then everybody who reads that would have no possible way to reject that according to the language of the day. And then with regards to bringing the infinite back in and making it a mathematical quantity, is still that there's something to be said for that was part of it. Spinoza's later works, which get into the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, here are just considered not so great, because they do not affect to reflect for Montesquieu and Locke, which are held up in very high regards as having anything to say about individuals, except to each their own, and every man for himself, and then let's get together, and that there was a certain kind of the idea of the social contract, but that otherwise Spinoza has some key points that I kind of more readily derive from Duns Scotus, who in a much briefer account, yet for that so much richer and more dense, as it were, gives for the philosophy that infinity is in, whereas before and otherwise it was out, and that yet infinity always finds itself back in, and so that thusly, from reading Copleston, it's like to so. So what Copleston arrives at after Spinoza is talking about Leibniz, and Leibniz is a great thinker in a lot of respects. He's very universalist. He talks about a theory. He talks about a universal language and these ideas of that the sort of efforts that arrived at bodies of knowledge like encyclopedias, dictionaries and encyclopedias of universal histories and universal knowledge, and a library. And so Leibniz has a lot of great ideas on philosophy, and mostly because he just picks and chooses the best he can find, and those which he finds the very, very most fulfilling, and that then also he relayed them in great letter writing campaigns. And that also that his great mathematical strengths included being able to formalize analysis and real analysis. As was discussed last time, that's kind of like the super classical, one of the first aspects of the super classical that arrives is after reason, after geometric series and Zeno's motion, and the idea that things are continuous, and that there's things as after the infinite or the infinitesimal. Then that much later there's Descartes and an analytical basis, and then Cavalieri and the methods of infinitesimals after the ancients' methods of exhaustion for the forward accounts, that then these days are arrived at after calculus, and then Dirac delta, not a real function, yet still with real analytical character, a zero width spike at the origin that's infinitely high, whose real analytical character has that its area equals 1. That's definitely these days about the only prominent example found in mathematics, the standard linear curriculum. And then it's ubiquitous, because then it's used to build up for the Fourier style analysis, a justification for that, which is super classical itself again. It's another example of building up infinitary reasoning that a deductive account must attain to, because an inductive account could always show itself so and not so. That then there's also these other accounts of how to do that when you have the Cantor space after the transcendent cardinals established that there's uncountable cardinals and inequality according to cardinals, to make for a Cantor space of all the zeros and ones. And then after that again, that the line continuity, because the first things that people learn are geometric series, the half again equals 1, and the iota values, that a constant infinitely many iotas equals 1. These are the kinds of mathematical accounts that are only available to reason, and they both do and don't stand up for themselves inductively, and then the deductively they're arrived at is a great thing. So that's where then Cantor space and then square Cantor space and these multiple continuous domains and multiple laws of large numbers makes for this 20th century, late 20th century, I guess you might say, by the time that's put back together, account of a 21st century and the least number of devices in the deductive inference for mathematics to arrive at super classical completions that make for this sensible, fungible, and tractable again. And that in the technical, that is more about how infinity is in the numbers, because it was always there. So, Nozick mentions the ineffable. How can we give something a name when we cannot make its name? Or indiscernibles. How can we tell two things apart and give each their due credence when we can't tell them apart? These kinds of things. Exists is a term in quotes here. This question parallels the familiar one put to coherence theories of truth. Won't there be many different, equally coherent and unified worlds? Well, if there's a discernible one, even if it's ineffable, there's one. If each is equally in accord with the principle of organic unity, why then does one hold rather than another? Insofar as they're the same, they don't. That different worlds are otherwise equally coherent, so equally in accord with the principle of coherence, does not show, however, that they cohere equally with this principle, so that every combination of the principle of organic unity with each such coherent world would have the same degree of organic unity. So organic unity is something he mentions many times in these few pages, and one usually associates that with the organic as an organism, and then it's like something in the garden that organizes itself. And so it grows like a garden, it's organic, and it's after something that grows for itself, vis-a-vis the synthetic or something that's built, to say. And so with regards to organic unity, then it's like with regards to matters of organism and structure, then unity usually reflects as an integral whole, and as for a monism, one thing. Just as through any finite set of points, an infinite number of curves can be drawn, yet only so many with the according to the isoparametric theorem, which minimize the volume or minimize the perimeter, which according to geometry have the shortest lines between these points, or according to great curves make for that the revolutions equidistant could be maximally distant, these kinds of things. Here he's talking about the long line of Dubois-Reymond in a sense, all the possible real value formulas, all their expressions, those yet meaning trichotomous, when those variables run out in the limits on the real line. Another continuum, bigger in a cardinality than the complete order of fields on the continuum, the linear continuum, the long line of Dubois-Reymond. That when for Nozick to raise this as a matter of geometrization, and he talks about past applications of the word, so different hypotheses or rules about applying the term are compatible with all the past data points of application. Any batch of particular items is a subset of an infinite number of different sets, where it is joined along with different things. So how can pointing to the batch of past correct applications fix which is the set of all correct applications? It does not. That there is one is a different thing, and then the set theory is extraordinary is to build up with after that is chosen as a theory with only one relation L, and so everything can be built in that because it's so simplified because there's only one relation L, and then it's true or false that A L B, and so then in extraordinary and inconsistent multiplicities is what's arrived at. Then there's the both A LB and A not LB applies as duality, dual monism, because it makes that there's a branch, just like positive numbers have negative square roots, negative even roots. They do. There's also for the identity dimension and in these roots of 0-bit, that besides always building higher and higher and higher than structure of an organism, is that for the deconstructive account to get lower, and then help bring up why this original analysis of the identity dimension and the roots of 0-bit is a rather inner sort of product. What results some of these things in examples, so that here Nozick's all possible worlds of these things has that there are theoretical worlds. They're each their own kind of domain of discourse, and whether they're equi-interpretable and model each other is that they do or don't. And then with regards to trying to make that fit and providing explanatory factors, it's that any of the explanatory factors work if they're sufficient. That's the usual notion of what suffices to make something so. What's necessary vis-a-vis what suffices is merely the necessary, but something that's more than the necessary would of course yet suffice, even if it's not simply necessary in the positive or negative of those kinds of cases. The principle of sufficient reason. This is a classical principle. Let us state this principle of sufficient reason as every truth has an explanation. Here it's that every truth is in this Comenius language exists. And then as regards to an explanation is that a theory that is attached to it so it can be having a model that exists is then that it has, every truth has an explanation. This is usually first principles and final causes. So truth does not need an explanation. No. For every truth P, there is some truth Q, which stands in the explanatory relation E to P. So this is kind of like Aristotle's, there is no unmoved mover. And he says, or asks, he poses this question, is this principle true? Does it apply to itself? And if so, what is its sufficient reason? Is the principle of sufficient reason, call it SR, a brute fact, or does it have a sufficient reason? And so this is often the idea of the chicken and egg, which came first, or how can something so arises from nothing to make it so? That is, as was discussed here quite a long time ago, is that first we haven't really addressed how Nozick addresses the fundamental question of metaphysics. But this is an example of what he's staring at, this void that somehow is. And then there's also the universe that somehow is. And it's both or either, and it could be either or both, and that it still results as there could be one or the other. And so, yes, there's a principle of sufficient reason. Even even if you claim that it's like, I don't have an ontological attachment to that. It's like something else might, and there's only one of them, so there is. Ultimacy. Philosophers push or iterate a question, usually about justification, so far that they cannot find any acceptable deeper answer. Well, there's not anymore. And so he's describing some of the problems of gaining a toehold in this sort of edifice above this sort of precipice of this tower of rain above the chasm of uncertainty, doubt, and irrationality. Fecundity and self-subsumption. So fecundity is usually like the fertility is that which produces. And then self-subsumption is like sublation is that if you can take something less that is kind of sublated. And then subsumption is that when it helps provide for itself, it produces for itself. So something like the Ding an sich is usually phrased as the simplest thing that could be this way. Kant's two ideas, one is the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Well, how could that be? It is. And the sublime, the thing greater than itself. So for any kind of relation, there's the thing that relates that's either self-similar or self-referential, that then all these usual paradoxes of a logic that arrives from that naively just make for a slightly briefer, broader deductive account why it just makes two. And then to have that there's a model that's a fragment, and then there's a model that's an extension, and this way there's both of them in this extraordinary theory vis-a-vis a standard model that's neither of those, and then positing the existence of that is that something must attain to it both ways and hold this silver thread all the way down the middle, right down the middle, as it were. So, and this is kind of just reading backwards with regards to this contents of the chapter, why is there something rather than nothing? And some idea, he quotes Nagel, the structure of science. In contrast to Hare's principle, consider the theory of the 16th century Kabbalist Meir Ben Gabi, according to whom only God's continuing production of the written and oral Torah maintains things in existence. And so he seems a question is like it's like these mumbling philosophers that always keep reiterating the theory, and it's like, well, is that anything more than a projection of that it already exists? That's just for itself. Although it does say that if you leave it alone, it would still exist. So it's not so much different that it doesn't take necessarily any other attachment to having kind of considered the realm of discourse and the domain of discourse in a thorough discourse, the il discorso, that it's a thing by itself also, because then that either way is in and out of itself. So for what that keeps then is like, it does stipulate in certain, it's like, yes, there is something to give an ontological commitment to. It's numbers, or it's geometry, or it's deity. In this case, framed as that which is the absolute, and as according to the numbers that come out of it, or the words here, that it is yet possible to help relate to these matters of canon and dogma and doctrine that is yet quite simple. And then there was some discussion of the inegalitarian theories. This is pretty much where we left off reading from Nozick before, because the idea was that it's possible that everybody has their own theory, and then there's matters of asymmetry and knowledge and then an advantage, and as with regards to that for being matters of mechanism of inference, that it's not saying much except that two domains of discourse to reasoners is reasonings are not necessarily the same as with regards to, yet though they attain to, at least arbitrarily, some common, meaning shared, body of knowledge, in fact. Explaining everything. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, quickly raises issues about the limits of our understanding. Here is sometimes that understanding does not suffice. There's a knowledge. Is it possible for everything to be explained? Not very practically, no. Yet at the same time, it is possible for an axiomless natural deduction to arrive at axiomless geometry to arrive in a more or less axiomless mathematical universe hypothesis that gives more or less, the usual dimensions of the resources of the objects, the contents, as far as the entire enterprise of correspondent and coherent and pragmatist theories of truth is one thing called the physical universe. That's explained, and it's usually considered to include everything. So it often is said that at any given time the most general laws and theories we know or believe are unexplained, but nothing is unexplainable in principle. Reflexive caring. And he talks about some reflections on the reflexive with regards to, as would be the accounts of the Vedas, as mentioned last time in the historical philosophy bit, that serve as very well-known examples of matters of contradistinction in matters of perspective and projection, helping effect to reflect that thusly this is geometric, and in the world where geometry is motion, and that as well, it helps for perspective and projection to help show how the Descartes and the Cartesian is in this Euclidean, which it is, and that it all arises from this axiomless natural deduction, and it counts in matters of inference and these kinds of things. The different notions of identity. There's identity, equality, and tautology, all with relation to intentionality and extensionality, which means equals, and that there's matters of order and the greater and lesser, and the comparatives and superlatives, which must exist in the language to have this first-class approach to their meaning, vis-a-vis the evident import and the weight of their statement and their utterance, vis-a-vis use-mention distinction, and the theory of the things, the language of the theory. Here he mentions again organic unity, so I'll see if I'll arrive at the definition of that in the next few minutes. There's been quite a consideration here that this is part of a philosophy. And so a reading from it is not really mentioned in any other particular authority on these things, yet as well it's part of all the philosophies. Each one their own domain of discourse is a domain of discourse, a theory with regards to whatever theory they may be in. He talks about proximity, the closest continuer, which here is kind of like the entelechy for the energy and entelechy. We seem unable to solve the general problem of unity. And so he talks about identity and unity. So here, for example, there's like a deconstructive account is after the identity dimension, and then that roots of unity is considered different than something's about identity, because unity, in that sense, reflects kind of like the integral numbers can be considered after the real numbers as all the points where they're constructive together to make an integral whole, the integers, is that unity is between 0, 1, and infinity, the infinity of 1. That the natural unit as a unity is only according to those three numbers is another way to look at that. So there's at least two things that need to be figured out with regards to any kind of mathematical attachment. Why there's different ways to consider what unity is. That which is united and that which unites being two different things. That usually the great facility of extensionality is that which unites vis-a-vis that according to the theory which is already united, the unity. Unities and wholes is the subsection. Doesn't the self-synthesizing view give the self the status of a collection or bundle, to use Hume's term, rather than a true unity? Yeah, sure it does. But there's deductive and inductive accounts to arrive at in either way, so, and vice versa. There's the land of questions that are tertium non-datur. There's only true or false. And the lands of ones that are not. And then there's the ones that are their own answer and ones that are not. So I'm glad I picked up this book for a while today because it helps reflect a little bit more on like the Hegelian. He mentions the fictitious, the fictian. So I've not heard of this word. It's a play on the word fictitious, but it's after ficti. That usually we point at Hegel instead of Fichte, but Fichte is brought up the dialectic as just a way of making an argument. The way it's a deconstructive account of inductive inference and syllogism to arrive at a way to break arguments, but then we won't say much more about that. A creative act, classification and entification, about closeness and distance, classification and entification. And the entity is that which kind of has some existence in itself. Ens. So the identity of the self. We skip past the beginning. So we entered the questions of identity vis-a-vis the fundamental question of metaphysics. That as I recall, having started reading this some time ago, and then it's about as with regards to explaining everything. So there's always the arguments arising after first principles and final cause. That logicist positivism has the first principles of the axioms, and the final cause is associated with the determinacy. And so you can just say that in the final cause is according to a scientific theory that, well, all we're doing is not validating our scientific theory anyway, so it's the scientific theory is why, so that the elements of the theory are the first principles of a sort. In the scientific method's philosophical strength is the final cause, because that's all it says. That's one of those things. Schopenhauer, he's got qualitas occultus. He's like, what's the explanation of everything? It's a qualitas occultus. You'll never know. As thing in itself, the will of the begetter is not different from that of the begotten, for only the phenomena, not the thing in itself, is subordinate to the principium individuationis. This is that the individuation is quite a big deal, because there's a continuum of things. And so making and taking an individual of this is to consider how there's a whole, how there's unity, how there's an entity out of a finite thing of these things. So this section of Schopenhauer reflects on Kant and the Ding an sich, as was mentioned, the thing on itself. As with regards to this is a section from The World as Will and Representation, section 60. We have now completed the two discussions whose insertion was necessary, namely that about the freedom of the will in itself simultaneously with the necessity of its phenomena, and that about its fate in the world that reflects its inner nature on the knowledge of which it has to affirm or deny itself. And so this just makes for that scientific theory, that theory itself is a free enterprise, and whatever words may relay, it may contain, and then whether that's attachment to things is just as mentioned, is just an act of reasoning and experiment, So in that sense, he's made a great grand write up to help support that logicist positivism is a modest, simple thing, but it doesn't necessarily get into why or why not to attach it to any other kinds of things. That it does. That it does. Each of these is only a pattern. From the first appearance of his consciousness, man finds himself to be a willing being, and his knowledge, as a rule, remains in constant relations to his will. That's not necessarily so. Because people grow, and they go through cycles and phases. So. Now he knows what he has to do and does not, as a rule, aim at other knowledge. That's not so. Schopenhauer has confused the positive and negative with regards to necessity and sufficiency. Maintenance of the body by its own powers is so small a degree of the will's affirmation that if it voluntarily stopped at this, we might assume that with the death of this body, the will that appeared in it would also be extinguished. That's not necessarily so, because there's a language and a domain of discourse. So he seems to have a kind of a closed view of things without much introspection, as Schopenhauer here is reading. The life's goals. Consequently, we can avoid both the height from which we can descend and immoderate joys. And then he says something about the Stoa, which I equate with pragmatist, non-critical, non-conscientious things that work for their happiness, that are not, they're not yet but happy with the closed way of things. The following remarks. So what was this thing? Oh, excessive joy and very severe pain were these two things to avoid, it says. And so there's no nothing, there's no universals. It's only a qualitas occultus, a hidden quality. For whatever nature and good fortune may have done, life is hard. So this is pretty much a statement of consciousness, and so that it's cogito ergo sum again, or that Schopenhauer is very much like Descartes if you take out all the metaphysics, and then he just talks about himself, pretty much. In very voluble, readable terms, as Kant puts it. For here there is a question of the worth or worthlessness of existence, of salvation or damnation. So it kind of reminds of Jasper's and the soul bit, when he says it's like, well, it's not a thing, but what's it worth, Is intelligible character, virtue. And he says that Schopenhauer's philosophy, he says, philosophy can never do more than interpret and explain what is present and at hand. It can never do more than bring to the distinct abstract knowledge of the faculty of reason the inner nature of the world, which expresses itself intelligibly to everyone in the concrete, that is, as feeling. So here, that's pretty simple. It's like, well, if you didn't notice, there's Duns Scotus. So... I say so we can see Schopenhauer as an observer. if not so much an authority in these matters. Sachs nuclear theory. So this is where we've been leaving off is a couple talks ago, is reading a few pages from Sachs nuclear theory. It's not electron theory. It's not electromagnetism. It's not atomic theory. It's nuclear theory. According to the Pauli principle, only two neutrons, two protons will be found in the same orbital state, usually with regards to helium-4 or something like that. The atomic number, the atomic weight, 1 AMU as atomic mass unit. After electron physics, the bare hydrogen nucleus, a proton, 1 AMU. The investigation of high-energy neutron-proton scattering provides convincing evidence for the existence of a property of the interaction akin to property C. Nucleons attract each other strongly only if they are in the same orbital state. So that is for this Dirac-Einstein positronium, white hole, electron nucleon C. Well, all right. Dear gentle readers and fellow earthlings, I shall so hope you have a great day this year. And in full thanks, you know, to you and of the things and of the events. So have a great day, and there'll be more next time here on Logos 2000. What metaphysics?